Well, when Mike, you're about to answer, let me layer this on top as you respond here. In your mind, is like you've heard the story, the young girl, the young boy going to go to Hollywood and meet their fame and fortune. That's the example. Is it even possible? Is it even possible to go find fame and fortune if you're at that level to make the top of the pops if you're not knighted in somehow? Anyhow, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's a good setup, Crow, because the way I have deducted that it works is we've got three tiers, if you will. So the first tier would be those musicians that make up bands or as an individual artist that are bloodline connected into the controlling system, into the pyramid of power. These would be bands and singers and artists. They're going to see very, very significant and prominent success and fame because they're bloodline, they're in the system. So they're going to be moved along. A lot of money is going to be put behind them to make sure that they get to where the social scientists want them to be. Then you have those that are not bloodline connected, but they are in secret societies, Freemasonry as an example. We'll just use that as the umbrella of secret society. And they are also moved along because they're going to promote the agenda. So we have the first tier, which is their bloodline, like Billy's bloodline. David Crosby was bloodline. And just by the sheer fact that they have that type of connection, it's assured that they're going to push the agenda forward. They're going to do what needs to get done. And then the second tier would be those that are in secret societies, regardless of what degree they're at. But, you know, the higher degrees they are in the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, the more they're going to be, the controllers are going to be assured that they're going to cooperate and push the agenda. So, you know, these bands are also going to have money put behind them. And then you have this third tier. And this third tier are artists, bands that are not in secret societies and they are not in the pyramid of power. However, they have resources or they have skills and talents that have been identified by the controllers that can be leveraged.
Can you give an example of what that level a band might be that you view at that level?
Let me see. Let's take a look at somebody like Britney Spears as an example.
Okay.
Just use her as an example, okay?
Okay.
Katy Perry is another.
Performers.
Yes, performers. And they're brought in because they can be shaped. They're groomed, they're handled. Now, were they groomed and handled prior to winding up on the radar, Tavistock's radar, or whatever social scientists' radar? I don't know. We can debate that till the cows come home.
Well, some of these people were Musketeers, so what was going on there?
Exactly.
There's
so
the talent pool, right?
Right. So that's right. So think of it exactly right, Crow. There's a talent pool. There's a pool of resources that are out there. And the controllers are always scouring it. And if they can make something of somebody, if they're going to fit the mold or the role of the next genre of music that they're going to put out and they're going to bombard the public with, they bring them in. But these types, they typically don't have a very long shelf life. They're used for a moment in time and then they're just discarded.
But what about the young African-American girl who was in a vampire movie, got really big, and then cashed it on a plane takeoff? Aja, what do you know who I'm talking about? Anybody?
Aaliyah.
Aja?
Aaliyah.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. So we have these layers. This is what I've identified. You know, it's one of those things where the controllers they're very creative and their system is very sophisticated. And so, you know, they're pulling from different pools of resources to be able to implement their agenda via the music industry and the entertainment industry. Because what I'm talking about now is not just music, but it's also in the entertainment industry. If we take a look at Hollywood as an example. So, yeah, so the bands that are really, really big, you know, they're in it. I mean, they're in it because they're actually tied into it from either a bloodline or from a brotherhood secret society perspective. And then the third tier are just those that they're bringing in and they're using them. They're just using and abusing them. They just happen to be good tools at the moment. And as soon as that tool is no longer useful, then they get discarded. Even bands that maybe are not aware of the agenda, and then they get signed to a major label, we have to remember that it's not just about the music, but it's also the symbolism that comes along with it. So the album jacket will have all types of Illuminati symbolism. And the band may not even be aware of what that symbolism means. They just came in and they recorded their tracks, but the way the record is packaged. And there are so many stories about songwriters and bands that have come in who got signed to a label. Their songs got altered, their songs got changed. So in order to fit what a producer deemed needed to get done in order to make that song, quote, marketable, which also includes, by the way, if an original band member was laid down the recorded track, let's say the guitar track, later on, a producer will bring in a ringer, a hired gun, and redo the guitar tracks or the bass track or the drumming. So there's all this stuff that goes on behind the scenes. And the point I'm trying to make without getting too long-winded here is I believe, there are bands and there are artists that are not immersed in the agenda. They may not even be really aware of it, but they're still manipulated based upon how the songs are put together, how it's packaged, and how it's presented when they go out and they play live, as an example. Like the whole stage presentation will have pyramids on it and eyes on it, all-seeing eyes. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring up some huge points based on the comments the two of you have just made. First of all, the idea of the throwaway people. Look at Britney Spears, good example. Look what happened to the poor girl. She lost her damn mind. Whether that was drugs or more, I think it was more. And the reason I think it was more is because of how the entertainment community felt sorry for her and swept in to try to be around her. But here's the thing about music like that, which is throwaway music. And by the way, you're not going to find key changes for the most part. It's been dumbed down, which also dumbed down music has a dumbing down effect, just to be brutally honest about it. There's a thing called nostalgia programming that I first brought up with Jason. I think it was episode 76, moments before my YouTube channel was deleted because we told the truth about Mandalay Bay and the dark magic that was going on there based on Macbeth and the Three Witches. Nostalgia programming dictates some of the following things, at least what I am aware of. There's probably a lot that I'll never be aware of. When you're 13 or 12 and you love Britney Spears, when you become 40 and you haven't heard that music in a long time and you do, that will sweep you right back to that childhood, to those pleasant memories. Matters not the quality of the music. It's just that the music serves as that magical smell you remember when you were young, that magical song, that magical time, your first kiss, and Britney happened to be on the radio. That nostalgia programming is among some of the strongest programming. So I want to make the point that even in so-called throwaway music, its day is not done when they're not recording anymore. In 20 or 30 years, the nostalgia programming abilities of that are going to be brought back on that generation. And to Mike's point about the packaging, I will just simply briefly bring up a thing called sigils. The packaging matters. Geometry has energy, but if anyone wants to take a look at sigils, you can look it up on your own time. It's a little bit like Dr. Emoto embedding intent into water. That's basically one aspect of what a sigil is. What is a sigil? It's a shape. One of the ways you make a sigil, just to make the point, is you come up with a sentence of what you want to accomplish, then you remove all the vowels, any of the doubled consonants, and you make basically a logo. That's one of the simplest ways to do it. And you embed your intent and the meaning from the sentence that initially served as the foundation. You can find this on almost any album ever made in one shape or form of a logo or something else. But guys, I want to bring up the dead ringer here. I want to bring up Supertramp. When I was in the 80s, I used to tell people Supertramp is such an underrated band, such a great band. They're using interesting instruments. They're not a carbon copy. You're not just hearing the same 12-bar blues you've heard to death. But what we know about Supertramp now underwrites what we're pointing out. On Breakfast in America, and words have meaning. They titled a track and an album, Breakfast in America. If you look at the artwork and you turn it backwards or look at it in a mirror, it says 9/11 right in the heading. And there's New York City has been put together. In other words, they're shadowing something like 22 years. I think it's the Master Mason building number. I forget, but I think it's 22 years before the fact. They're preluding the 9/11 attacks. Now, if you take that band apart, you will find that first, one of the stories goes that some mysterious figure paid them $1 million to get together. They went out on tour. It was unsuccessful. So they pulled them back and they put them through boot camp. And that's how they finally got them on the road making money. If you go look at where their albums were recorded, it's in old Masonic temples that had since been turned into recording studios. My point is that Supertramp is case and point for what we're talking about. And how can anyone listen to that band now knowing that their album cover preluded the event that tumbled us for good? The reason we are where we are now is because that event occurred. That is the beginning of the open fall of America. And for anyone who's not quite caught up, we are no longer an empire. We will not be the empire we once were. We will not be bullying people. We've been demoted, just to make it clear. And that's what I'm talking about. 22 years before the fact, they encoded the event, which had to already be clearly planned. They recorded their album in Masonic temples that had been converted over. And I just want to open up that conversation. I don't know what you two might know about the band, which really does underscore the proof that's in the pudding here.
It's funny you should bring them up because before you said Supertramp, I was thinking about that album cover.
It's a hell of a thing.
Yeah, it's predictive programming is what it is. And
Yep.
the point that you made, Crrow, about the planning, this is something that a lot of folks really don't understand. The planning is not done like day by day or week by week. They have things planned out decades in advance, at least.
Yes.
That's why it's very difficult for folks to get their heads wrapped around this, because most people can't plan beyond a day or two or maybe even a week because of everything that goes on in their life. And then what people do is they take their own lives and extrapolate that and say, well, everything works that way. And they don't understand that there is a controlling mechanism, there's a controlling infrastructure that controls the world. I try to explain to my audience, we've got organizations like the World Economic Forum, we have Tavistock, we have the Committee of 300, we have the Fabian Society, we have the Rockefeller Foundation, we have the Bilderbergs, we have the Trilaterals, we have the Council on Foreign Relations, we have Davos. What do you think these organizations do? You think that they just create the buildings and play solitaire all day long? This internationalist structure is there for a reason, and it's because it's running the world. The whole facade that you think that your president is actually running something. I mean, it's even a bigger joke now with Joe Biden, right? I mean, but be that as it may, or that your prime minister, if you're out in Europe someplace, is actually calling the shots. I mean, you are very, very misguided, and you're really not awake, and you don't understand how the world really works. So taking it back to the Supertramp album again, 20 something years ago, predictive programming, and we have lots of examples like that. I mean, we have examples like that in The Simpsons, for God's sake.
We do. Isn't it astonishing that The Simpsons gets history better than the evening news? But
Right.
with regard to Supertramp, I want to make the point of how some of this magic works. You bought the music, you loved the music, you poured your energy, your spirit into the people planning this event. And just to make a point, it's insulting. And it's insulting only for people who've woken up from the dream. Everyone else is considered profane, a sheep, whatever they might want to label them. If you look at the album cover, they've taken the Statue of Liberty and turned her into a waitress. Her name is Libby. Liberty is a word that is used heavily in the military. It has nothing to do with freedom. When I was in the Marine Corps, if I got liberty, I was informed how many hours of liberty I had, and then it was over.
Right.
The back of that album is about a meal. It's break fast. So 22 years, I think it was 22 years before the fact, they were announcing that they were going to break the fast and go open, operational. Now, you will notice she's holding an orange juice. Orange is the only color that reduces numerically to 33. It also represents the sun, or maybe even, wait for it, the May sun. There is so much that has been put into this album work that you learned to love long before you comprehended, most still don't, that it was pre-echoing one of the most horrendous things that's ever happened to this country that put us on the trajectory of where we are now. A country that is facing cryptocurrency that is programmable, that will slave out everything you do. You can buy this, you can't buy this. You can go here, you can't go. That's where we're going. This is all based on the broken fast or the breaking of the fast to go operational. We're in the open. Everything we do now is on the evening news because these people are so freaking spellbound, they can't even distinguish their own index finger from their toe. These are the ideas behind it. But I want to make that point because, Mike, you and I remember album covers. Jason, to some degree, you do too. It was a whole experience. That album meant so much and it had such an importance. But that artwork, when used to evil ends, we have given it our energy, haven't we?
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's another thing I explain to my audience. There's two types of energy. There's your spiritual or non-physical energy, your consciousness, and then there's your physical energy. So they steal your non-physical or consciousness by having you focus on these bands or these entertainers and these celebrities. So as you're focused on them in the land of occultism and magic and ritual, they're harnessing that energy. And it doesn't matter whether the audience believes that that actually takes place. This is what the priesthood, the magicians, and the occultists believe. This is what they practice. So they're capturing your consciousness, they're capturing your thinking, they're capturing your focus and your concentration. And by doing that, they're able to steer you. Like Crrow was just saying, you're looking at the album covers or even singing the songs, because a lot of these songs have backmasking in them and
Right.
Right. So when you're singing them and you're humming them in the song from the perspective of an occultist, you are engaged and continuing the ritual. Now, the physical energy that they're usurping from you would be you buying the records, buying their merch, going to the concerts.
Physical labor.
Physical labor, because you have to actually work. You have to physically go out and work to make a buck. And then you're taking the money that is left after they steal it through taxes, and you're giving it back to them in the form of buying records, CDs, DVDs, merchandise, and so on. And I have explained so many times, Crrow and Jason, to my audience that we have to stop the idol worship, because that's really what it is at the end of the day. Think of these rock stars and these entertainers and these celebrities. They're an intermediary, right? They're like the lesser gods. And if you watch the series American Gods, it talks about the new gods are the technology gods. And that's what they do. That's how they usurp your non-physical and your physical energy. It's by pulling you into this pop culture, into social media, into the music, and into the entertainment industry.
And they pulled that. That show got too close, I think. They pulled that right in the middle of its popularity.
Yeah, after 3 seasons, it got pulled. And but it was, in my opinion, it was a very important series.
Yes.
Because it talked about the old gods and the new gods, and the new gods are the technology gods.
Right.
And this is what's playing out.
No, it was a very important little piece for someone who eyes to see with, and it was so blatant that they were doing similar things to test how awake you are. They kept doing these drone shots or aerial shots where someone would be on blacktop that's all cracked, but if you were paying attention, you would realize that the cracks spell somewhere in America. Yeah. They were being very specific, but one of the biggest things that came out of that relates exactly to what Mike and I are talking about, stealing your energy. And actually, it's not a theft, you're giving it, but I'll just call it stealing because you don't comprehend that you're in a transaction. So you are being duped. They did a god named Vulcan who did bullets and guns. He made them, manufactured them. And this is where they tipped their hat in a way that I've never seen it tipped before. One of the guys that came with the main god, who was portraying Odin, an old god, he always carried a sledgehammer and he worked in a slaughterhouse. killing pigs, hitting them in the head with a sledgehammer. Every one of those pigs was a sacrifice being collected, a blood ritual. Now, the guy who made the guns, they made the point by showing on the butt of the bullet where it might say Winchester was his claim. It had his little sigil, the little symbol, and his name. And while the new God, where the old gods were saying, where can we get our sacrifices and our worship? He was living high on the hog, because every one of those bullets has the potential to kill someone. And when it does, or it hurts someone, they collect the ritual blood sacrifice energy. And these are bridges that are so far for most people, but I'm glad you brought that up. Mike, is there anything you want to bring up? When we come back in the second hour, I'm going to bring up the idea that fame is on loan. I'm going to use Prince, and then I'm going to delve further into the idea of worship that you just opened the door for. But is there anything else you'd like to get in the last few minutes of hour one?
The only thing I can think of, Crow, is when we talk about worship, I explain again to my audience that if you're going to invest your focus on someone, it needs to be yourself, because you need to develop yourself as an individual. It's a soul's journey, and your soul came here to have the experience and to learn. It's about soul development. And by doing what they're doing, the technology gods, what they're doing is that they're keeping you from realizing and manifesting who you are as an individual and as a sovereign soul. I've said to folks, the controllers want you to focus on community. It's communal stuff. When you do that, without first developing the individual aspect of yourself, then you're going to have a weak community. So as an individual, you have to work on being creative, resilient, resourceful. And then when you have a creative, resilient, and resourceful number of individuals and they come together as a community, then your community reflects those attributes and those characteristics, and you're going to have a strong community. This is why they, all the time, they take the individual out of the equation. They don't want anybody talking about individual development or a focus on individuality. They pour it all into the communal bucket. And that's why we're at today, because we have very weak communities, whether it be local communities, national communities, worldwide communities. It really doesn't matter. Most people have lost their individual sovereignty, and they're not coming from that perspective. And this is why we have the problems we have today, because people are relying on people outside of them to fix the issues. So when you don't develop your individuality, what you're doing is you've actually given up your authority. You've disempowered yourself because you handed the authority over to somebody else outside of you. And when you do that, you empowered the people or the entities that are outside of you. So all the people who are on TV telling you what it is you should do and not do, what's safe and what's effective, all of that stuff, people who are following their leads, you have abdicated, you have given up your will, your authority, and your empowerment, and you handed it over to those types.
It's a good point, because underneath it all, you've forgotten what applies to you. And what applies to you is the idea, and it's deeper than the idea of sovereignty. I am. You should think about that. You should go back to the Bible and read where that's said, and you should consider what it means. And then consider, in every spiritual tradition that I think has value, you will find, don't go looking for the creator all over, look within.
Right.
And now think about what it means to say, I am. It's exactly what Mike said. That's why communism is such a difficult thing. And unfortunately, I've lived my entire life with 9 of the pillars of communism in place in this country. People say what's coming, what they're going to try to do is some kind of a bizarre, extreme techno-communism. It remains to be seen. But I now have many people who agree with me that are way more spiritually adept than I am, that say what's about to happen is going to fail in the long run. We're going to wrap up hour one here. When we come back, I'm going to open up with the idea that fame is on loan, because Mike bringing up American Gods. American Gods put more on the table than I've ever seen any modern show put on the table, and then they cut it. They cut that umbilical cord right as it was picking up.
The Beatles, just to use them as the ultimate example, that mystique is still lasting.
It is. It's constantly refostered. And with the new movie and all the AI nonsense, I am convinced that there are portrayals of people like Lenin that were made by AI and inserted in there. I am convinced of it. Whether I could ever prove it, probably not. We're going to wrap up hour 1 of episode 496. We're going to take a few minutes to take a break, and we're going to come back and we're going to nail a important hour 2. I'll put it that way. With that, you can catch the first hour of any episode at Crrow777radio.com, Crrow777radio.com. All right, now welcome back to Crrow777 Radio. This is hour 2 of episode 496. Jason Lindgren is back, as is Mike Williams or Sage of Quay. And Rose pinged me. I can never remember. I don't know why it's so simple. The blockchain that's housing us on the World Wide Web 3 is called Cast Garden. And we've put all our first hour content out there. Part of it I did intentionally because of the blockchain, but that's a whole other conversation I'm not getting into right now. Welcome back, guys.
Good afternoon.
Welcome.
All right, let's jump in where we promised we would. It was years ago, and there were a few early voices that are among the people who influenced me the most on YouTube in terms of what we've been doing all these years. One of those was Dave J. I mean, he run into a fire headlong if he thought he had a reason to do it. He never shied from anything, and the result of that was they just removed him from everywhere all the time. And he brought up the idea of what fame is, and I've since walked with it away. So what I accept is correct right now is fame is on loan. Imagine one day you're just somebody, and let's just use a musician, and you want to be famous. Until you are knighted, you're not. At some point, someone says, we're going to do this album and market it and make you huge. You're going to basically live like a king, kind of, from here forward. You're going to have money. You won't need money. You don't really need a passport. You can go wherever you want. You're going to be treated differently than a so-called civilian. But that's on loan. And I am now convinced by personage such as Prince that they knew exactly how long it was on loan. The first album he put out that made it big was Purple Rain album, right? It was, I think it's 1983 or 84, might be 84, I don't know. But in it, if the elevator tries to get you down, go crazy. Well, they portrayed him as dying in an elevator. That was pre-echoed in a Rick and Morty when the scientist formerly known as Prince, or however they did it, they made a version of Rick who was Prince, and they showed him killed in the elevator before Prince was killed. But here's the thing. Prince knew it. And the whole time that he was fighting for his contractual life, he knew it had to do with his name. That name is what's on loan to you, right? When your name is made famous, I'm convinced that a lot of people probably don't even, does Britney Spears own her own name? I don't know. But, that's maybe not a good example. Take the name of a big band. Who knows who owns the rights on that? They'll show the public as if the band does. But what he did is he ditched his name and went to an unpronounceable symbol, proving that he knew the problem had to do with the name. So let's open up the conversation there.
Yeah, I think this goes along with what we said in the first part, Crrow, where they own you. If you're going to achieve any level, significant level of fame and fortune, there's going to be concessions that you're going to have to make to get there. They dangle the carrot. And if you want more, they'll give you more. But in getting more, there are going to be things you're going to have to do, things you're going to have to participate in. There are going to be consequences. And there are going to be things that you're going to get involved in that you normally wouldn't touch or you wouldn't get involved in. But, if you're chasing the paper, you're chasing the fame and fortune, and you really want it and you can taste it, people do certain things. And so his name, Prince, there's got to be a contractual agreement in place which said that as an individual, I doubt that he would be able to go off and do something under the name of Prince without having significant legal implications and complications in trying to do that. I mean, we see this with bands that broke up and they want to go out and say, I'm trying to think of a band off the top of
Creedence Clearwater Revival is one, right?
Right. I want to go out and be Creedence. And then, no, you can't do that. you can't do that. No, you cannot.
Fogarty is another.
Right. It's a machine. It's tied together with contracts. There's tons and tons of money involved. And forget about the whole control mechanism. Just think about it from the standpoint of the greed of the money. And there's going to be a lot of artists that are going to be stifled and not even realizing that they're going to be suppressed or stifled down the road because they really didn't understand what it is they signed up for.
So at the time when the whole Prince thing was happening, I mean, there was a beer being released. I don't remember all the things. I think for some reason, Hoover, one of the big dams, was flashed purple right as it was happening or something like that. There were so many indicators, something to do with the Prince's or the Queen's birthday, if I remember correctly. But there were so many things. But one of the things that really stuck out to me, and Jason's probably going to have to help me with the name of the song from the band America, the first time this country ever heard these two words put together, as far as I know, Purple Rain, was in an America song. And it's a whole verse. And it basically talks about a guy named Joe, which was one of Prince's aliases. And it says, you know, what are you going to do? I don't know. It's okay. You can always change your name or you can do these things. It looks like you've been hit by Purple Rain. Do you know that? Is it Ventura Highway, Jason?
Yeah, I believe so.
So I think it's Ventura Highway. But that was written in. And so I started chasing this down, and as fate would have it, the internet was in full swing then. Someone had reached out to the supposed author of that song and said, why did you write that verse? And he responded, I couldn't tell you. And it was just thing after thing where you could see, like, is it really possible that a big band like America back in the day is prepping up for a guy that we're going to hear about in the 80s?
The thing we should also note is the word rain. And I was actually rereading Daniel Esterlin's book on Tavistock, and he has a couple of pages dedicated to Rain Man, and a lot of rap and hip hop artists. I think Eminem is one of them. They have the lyric Rain Man. What does that mean? Well, rain and Rain Man implies a deal with the devil, deal with Satan. It's a pact. So when they sing about Rain Man or they sing about rain, the first thing we should think about knowing this is, are they communicating out that there was a pact, there was a going to the crossroads moment that put this artist front and center? Like even the Beatles song, Rain, The Who, Rain on Me.
Spelled as a reigning monarch, spelled not like rain on your head, but as R-E-G, you know, it's
right.
Like a monarch reigns.
Exactly. So, but they do wordplay all the time. You guys know this. Think about how many times in videos, album covers, you see an umbrella, rain. So this is something that I want to point out too. I found a link to it. You won't find much on Rain Man. It seems to have been scrubbed.
Because of Estelin.
Yeah, probably because of Daniel's book. But I did find one link which was very informative. And this is something that I presented out to my audience about, I guess about 2 or 3 weeks ago, as it pertained to the Beatles and the song Rain. But there are a lot of songs that refer to rain and or Rain Man. And from an occult perspective, it's pointing back to a pact. It's a deal that you made to get where you are.
And pulls in the symbolism of the umbrella.
Yes.
Anyone who wants to read Daniel Estelin's book, I know exactly what he's talking about. I've read it a few times. I even referenced it and took research further. Some of my world population research was based on where Estelin started and some of the clever methods he laid down. That's how I leveraged off to do mine. By the way, Rose just pinged me. When Prince was dying, the Queen released a Purple Rain beer, which is spelled R-E-I-G-N, to reign as a queen would. But this is the thing. I think most people have it in their minds that they could become famous. And I don't know what you guys think. I think maybe occasionally that happens, but I think it's like less than a fraction of 1%. I think someone is chosen out for whatever reason, or even groomed maybe, but think of the idea of the America song. If all that's correct, and all those 40 years or whatever it is prior, they're queuing up for a guy named Prince or someone who's going to sing a song that makes him famous called Purple Rain. As a matter of fact, think about this. So he then goes on to play the biggest show in the world, which is Super Bowl halftime. One of the biggest shows in terms of how many people are watching. That is huge. And what happens is he opens up with Purple Rain, it rains. So you suppose they did a little weather mod there for him, or was that all just chance? We can't answer these questions, but I am completely convinced that the idea that you have talent and you head off to Hollywood and find fame and fortune, I don't think it works that way. What do you think, Jason? Do you accept that it works that way?
I think there's a percentage of them that are probably just moneymakers. They're there because they need extra fodder. But the biggest of the biggest of the biggest, pretty sure that's a setup for one reason or another. And Mike broke down the tiered system, and I think that's probably pretty accurate.
It's crazy to consider because, what is the culture of America? The way I say it is we watch some movies and we like some TV shows. Oh yeah, and we listen to some music. So basically what we're talking about here is how culture is shaped.
Yeah, I don't think, going back to Jason's comment, very few bands I think are organic in the true sense. Going back to the three tiers I spoke about before, even if a band is talented and they have talented songwriters and they're very good musicians, the record label, which is all plugged into the controlling system, plugged into Tavistock and so on, it's going to be packaged in a way to ensure that the controller's agenda gets communicated out. So one way or another, if you're recording on a major label, you're plugged into the system whether you know it or not.
Yep.
And like Jason said, for the big bands, there's no question that they're in on the agenda from day one. That you just don't reach that level of fame and fortune and notoriety.
I think they're always going to need openers.
Yeah.
If you want to call them that, like they just need some extra bands.
Right.
So maybe they're not necessarily aware of what's going on, but it doesn't matter because they're still on these labels, or they're still with this management company, and they're going to get them somewhere. And all these things are still going to be done to them whether they know it or not.
Right. It's like what what Crrow said before. We're talking about the sigils, right? So let's just say a band puts out a record. Let's just say hypothetically, it's organic. They wrote all their own stuff. They're great musicians and all. And then the record company puts the record out, and the front cover is a gigantic pyramid. Right? I think of the Earth, Wind, and Fire album covers as an example. It was just loaded up with all kinds of Illuminati, Egyptian mystery symbolism. That's how they do it. It's not always the band members, like you said, Jason, being completely awake and aware of it. They may not be at all, but the controllers, the labels, like I said, they're a big piece of this agenda. They're going to make sure that there's going to be some piece of their agenda that's going to be communicated out, especially visually, because people love the visual aspects of it, right? So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there.
I would suggest to you that the Purple Rain album was that, but what did they do? They ponied up for a picture, right? A film at the same time. So as they broke this big album, which exploded at the time, it was put everywhere by the movie that accompanied it. It has every appearance that someone somewhere greenlighted this. The funds were made available and the machine went to work. They knew they had the music, because there's no arguing with the music, but that's maybe enough of Prince. Tried to make the point. Let's move on. What is worship? And I think that the movie, or the HBO special that you brought up called American Gods, went a long way to demonstrating what worship actually is. What's a good example? So in society, a guy who's fallen madly in love with a girl, and you say to that guy, well, you worship her. Well, what are you saying to him? Why would you use those words? Well, because that's all he thinks about, right? His whole life is concentrating on this new love of his life. But what is it actually? And if you watch American Gods, you'll get a good idea. But let me ask you something. If you're a person who holds your cell phone for, let's say, 8 hours a day doing one thing or another, could that be considered worship? I'll open it up. What do you think, Mike?
It's conditioning. It's brainwashing at the very least. You've been conditioned to hold that phone, bring it with you everywhere, look at it, even aimlessly. In other words, you are bored, as an example, and you're just going to scroll through your phone and all that stuff. But you're worshiping the technology. Maybe I should say it that way.
I like it.
right? So you're brainwashed and conditioned to being connected to that phone. There's no reason to be connected to it, folks. That's the thing you have to understand. Because years ago, when you didn't have these phones to take around with you, it was actually connected to the wall in your house. Life was okay. You got along just fine. If somebody called you, it went into the message machine or whatever, and then you got back to them when you were able to, and things were, like I said, they were fine. But the worshiping piece of it, it's the
How about the game Tetris? They're about to put a movie out on Tetris.
yes.
Can you imagine if someone came up with a way to know how many hours in the world had been spent on the game Tetris? I would argue that that's a form of worship.
Yes, you're worshiping the technology. That's what you're doing. You're dedicating enormous amounts of time of your life doing that versus something else, something more productive, more creative, more imaginative. So that's what I said before about them stealing from you or removing from you your focus and your concentration, your consciousness. That's how it works. So you're going to tell me that you can't think of anything better to do in your life than to stare at your phone 6 to 8 hours a day? And if you answer, well, that's what I like to do, then you're a lost soul. I'm sorry.
But my point is, think of how we typically would worship. So in where I grew up, Sunday was supposed to be the day of worship. Now, until I was 14 years old, my mother held up her end of the bargain that she agreed to when I was adopted by my parents, that I was to be raised Lutheran. And she did not drop the ball. She did raise me Lutheran. She took me and my brother every Sunday. As we got older, she had to bribe us. But our idea of worship was you drove in on a Sunday. I think all told, it might have been an hour, probably closer to 45 minutes actually in the sermon there, where what are we doing? We're worshiping. Well, what does that mean? It means we're paying attention. We're dedicating our energy and our focus to biblical concerns. That's our worship. And then I started to imagine gaming as an example. Can you imagine if you took the hours of a lifetime the average young person has put into gaming and had translated that to some other endeavor in the world, how much they could have got accomplished? And I think that's really what we're looking at here, is they realized with the technology, they could get, even if you want to call it something other than worship, I kind of think it is worship on average. I'm just saying. I mean, what do you think, Jason?
Worship is such an odd thing, and I see so many people getting wrapped up in, I don't think they're living life, let's put it that way. I think that there's so much more to life than most people realize, and by getting wrapped up in something as stupid as a phone, I remember the 90s before all these phone things kicked off, and we did get along just fine.
Yeah, so many lost people with that stuff, with the technology.
I just think it's consciously, the more I learned about AI when we covered it, looking at the wisdom of the crowd and the law of large numbers, and what I began to realize is these programs estimate you've got this many million seconds in your life. How do we get them all? All the search returns are, based on your worship. You're interested in whatever you are. They then put a hook in that. Oh, here's a link for that girlfriend you knew in 7th grade. Oh, here's a link. I know your hobby is this. And what they do is they try to get every second. Well, before we came back on the air, we were talking about how people in this part of the world were being fooled so easily back in the 80s and even the 90s. And part of it, in my view, was due to having been brought up and taught to think linear. And so what would happen, which is well demonstrated in the show American Gods, is we see a new name and a new costume, and so we automatically assume that's a new person. As a matter of fact, and I know people will go back and watch this, which I think is actually useful for a rare change. There's so much packed in there. What it deftly did is show this guy Odin. He's also Wednesday. He's also Wotan. He's 50 people. And this is what shows up in the devil's pulpit, that we couldn't crack the code because of the way we think. And what goes on is a single actor changes an appearance, a costume, a name, and that's where we get lost. We think now that's a new personage altogether, when in fact it's not. And I think that's key. I mean, what do you think, Mike?
Well, it's basically something that we see today, even in pop culture, where it's a remake. of a person. It's a remake of a movie. It's a remake of a song. They just dress it up differently. But at its core, if you go back to the original version of it, there is an original. And but people don't think in terms of going back to the very beginnings of anything or to do the research to do that. And what they do is they just grab onto whatever comes to their attention or whatever is in their awareness at the moment. And that becomes a defining moment. That becomes definitive to them. So they don't spend any time comparing. They don't understand when we talk about gods as an example that it's ubiquitous across many different times during history, different cultures and different eras and different ages, that many of these gods they're the same God. It's just that they were given a different name and they were maybe dressed a little differently, and maybe a couple of attributes and characteristics were changed here and there to make, so that it didn't map exactly to a previous God. But, it's your point, I guess, Crow, is that it all does go back to a central source or a beginning where that's the foundation. And from there, it kind of takes on a life of its own as we go through different periods in time. People in general don't have the bandwidth to research this stuff and to really understand it. So whatever it is that's presented to them at right now is what it is that they believe it is and what it is that they accept.
So let's switch back over to music. Do you two still have bands that you respect as somehow free and clear of the things we've been talking about? You know what I'm getting at?
Yep.
Okay, go ahead.
It's a good question. So I'll give you my answer. Not really. And because the work that I've done looking into the Beatles and the music industry, but especially the Beatles, because, they're basic. When I talk about foundational types of things, they are foundational to the music industry. So what I have done is to move more toward independent artists, Crrow and Jason. So as an example, back in 2021, I released the great indie playlist. So I have a lot of musicians and artists, some producers that subscribe to my YouTube channel, especially my Beatles channel. And I had them submit their songs. And so one song per artist, and it had to be an original, no covers. And I did the same thing a couple of months ago for 2023. What you find is that there is a tremendous amount of talent out there that is organic, and it's not tainted by the agenda of the controllers or the record labels and the producers and all that stuff. So my quick answer is that there are very few bands that I used to listen to all the time when I was growing up that I look at today and say, yeah, they were organic, or they were not tainted or touched by the system, because it's not true. I know it's not true. I know in one way or another, they have been touched and tainted and contaminated by the controller's agenda. So I lean today far more toward indie music. That's my answer. A long way of saying it, but that's where I've landed.
I think what you just said is critically important.
I don't see Pink Floyd, for instance, who I really like, having been anywhere near as much of a manipulation tool as, say, the Beatles for manipulation that other bands were. But on the other hand, I completely accept the fact that maybe they were. And I don't care. I appreciate the music for what it is, and I logically detach myself from that aspect of it. It's like, okay, well, I know what the music business is. I know what the entertainment industry as a whole is. Can I still appreciate Dark Side of the Moon for being an incredible album? Of course I can.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jason. I'm in the same boat. I can still go back and listen to these songs and appreciate the musicianship, the songwriting, the craftsmanship behind the songs, but I listen to it with a discerning ear, knowing what I know. So I can still go back and listen to Beatles songs and say, that's a really good song, because you know why? Because it's a really good song.
Plus the nostalgia of it, right? You were young, that's going to draw you back. But as far as Pink Floyd, I did the same thing, Jason. I thought, come on, David Gilmour, there's never going to be a time you convince me that someone else bumped him out of a studio to do his guitar part. He's that good. He's that good. Not only is he that good, that sound is unique all the way through. There's no breaks where you'd be wondering, is that really, did Gilmore write that lead? It's a Gilmore lead. You can hear it. But here's what I began to notice, because I didn't want it to be true anymore. And of all the bands that I still do listen to, Pink Floyd is among them. I acknowledge a lot of it's nostalgia. But there was a concert when Prince died where Gilmore did Purple Rain. Ding, 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 ding. And guess what? Guess who came up on the stage? Crosby, Stills. It's all the world's a stage. And to be at that level, I don't think you're independent. And how do we begin to address things like how many hundreds of weeks was Dark Side of the Moon at the top of the pops? I mean, I think that means something. I started to have a real love-hate relationship with the music I grew up with, because I was so pissed off that I knew I'd been a tool. I knew I'd been programmed by the very thing that I loved and learned how to play and basically worshiped, if you want to be honest about it. I saw your list, Mike, and I admired that you did that because I knew why you did it. And I think it's a good idea.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to say before we move off this topic is, even when bands argue with each other, we have to understand that, especially with a lot of these large bands, they're Freemasons. They're in the Masonic structure. And the Masonic structure is a corporate structure. It operates the exact same way. And so they are made, opportunities are made available to them, but they still have to vie for position. They still have to compete within the Masonic system to move up the ladder or to become successful. The thing is, because they are Freemasons and they're in secret societies, they have the opportunity to do that. They have the opportunity to at least compete, whereas you and I do not. We are outside that pyramid. So we're not going to see those opportunities, and we're not even going to be able to have the opportunity to debate or fight with each other as band members and split bands up and regroup and do this and do that, because we're not in the club. So it's not one of these things where it's always smooth sailing for these bands and these band members and these artists. They're humans, after all. I mean, they are. I mean, they have a different philosophy than we do, but they still have human emotions like anger and stuff like that. So when I take a look at some of these bands and these stories about them breaking up and who hates who and who's fighting with who, and then they get back together again to reunite and so on. I mean, I look at it as, well, okay, but at least you have the opportunity to do that. Whereas somebody like myself, you, Jason, you, Crrow, or any number of folks who are listening to this right now who are musicians and artists, and, in bands, you're not going to have that opportunity. You're just not.
No, there's no backing system. A fight's a
No.
fight. But I think I can underscore what you're saying with the character of Kramer. Does everyone remember Kramer from Seinfeld?
Yeah.
I will remind people that in the 90s, there was nothing bigger on television for a period of time than Seinfeld. I've mentioned many times that in San Diego, and this is in the 90s, the street was empty everywhere in San Diego. I think it was a Thursday night, if I remember correctly, the last episode of Seinfeld, which was a two-parter. But Kramer went out to be a comedian. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm doing this from memory, he was filmed calling a black man a nigger or something like that.
Yes.
That went viral. If I further am not misremembering, he made it to the cover of Masonic Monthly magazine shortly after that. Does anyone else remember what I'm saying?
I remember the situation. I remember him making the comment he made on stage, but I don't recall the Masonic magazine cover.
I'm going to look it up real quick because it's a big deal. Maybe if Rose is listening, she can. Yeah, there it is. It's on Scottish Rite. He's on the cover of Scottish Rite, September 2000. Maybe if Rose has a minute, she can tell me if I've remembered correctly that he made this album cover after he was filmed in a nightclub using a derogatory term. Now, we should also remember that to use the word nigger back then was not as outlawed as it is now. It was catching up. It was about to be. But the way I remember it is that he was filmed racially slurring a black man that had heckled him. And then shortly after, he was put on the Scottish Rite magazine cover, which would lead me to believe that he was directed to do what he did.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff is scripted, Crrow. Folks don't want to really believe that. There's a tremendous amount of scripting that goes on.
Is it common for people of color to be Masons? Does anyone know?
Yeah.
It is.
They have their own Masonic lodges, yes.
Yeah, the Prince Hall Masons.
So wait a minute, they're segregated? Like there's a black Mason is not with a white Mason?
Yes and no. Up until a few decades ago, absolutely, it was segregated. The Prince Hall Masons were for black folks. That was it.
Really?
They've had to get over that, to put it bluntly. So black people can now be in the regular lodges, but you still don't see it very much.
Yeah, I as I thought about it, I began to think, wait a minute, I don't think I've ever seen an African American associated with masonry in the way that I've seen so many white people, which made me wondering. But we'll look it up. I'm sure someone will tell me if I remember correctly. Pretty sure it went filmed doing a racial slur. That goes all over the evening news, coast to coast, and we know what the media does. And then the magazine cover. I hope I don't have that backwards. But another good example, and we've got to touch on it. I mean, come on, even the name of the band, Queen. Everyone assumes that it was a sexual name, which is a little bit interesting because as far as I know, there was only one non-heterosexual Freddie Mercury in the band and the other three were. So doesn't it seem a little weird that you would name your band Queen on those terms? But let's pull it back to reality. Androgyny was huge when Queen took its name. But have you guys noticed that since Freddie's passing, Queen has been getting paid God knows how much money. Their music is in everything. It's on so many commercials, advertisements, in the movies. Have you guys noticed this?
Yeah, I've
Sure.
noticed that Queen is still front and center.
And he, if I'm not mistaken, the head of that band is an astrophysicist.
Brian May. Yeah,
is
Brian
he an
May.
astrophysicist?
Yes.
Right. But there is a definite connection to the royalty somehow. And who can forget him with his regal sounding guitar, which is another piece of this, because it really does have kind of a regal sound to it. Standing on, I think it was Buckingham Palace, right? Do you remember that? Brian May being filmed on the top of the palace playing whatever it was he played?
I think I might have missed that clip, but it doesn't surprise me.
Well, he's also been knighted.
Yeah, he's been knighted, but I think he might have been playing the national anthem or something. But I mean, how can you ever? Oh, there it is. She just wrote me back. So Kramer, whatever his real name is, I've forgotten. He made the N-word comment in 2006, and he makes the cover of Scottish Rite in 2003. So I did have it backwards, but it shows, right?
Yeah, now with Queen, Crow, I think it goes both ways. It points back to the crown, but also Freddie was like rock's version of Liberace. You know,
He really was.
you had two different meanings. One pointed back to the crown and back to the Queen, and the other one had to do with the agenda at that time. Really was hot and heavy with homosexuality.
Remember when David Bowie, who was a cancer, died? I think it happened in the sign of the crab, and his age was 69, which is the symbol for the sign of cancer. But the thing about crabs is they're encoding the blue blood idea. So there's definitely a connection. But Queen always stuck out to me as completely insider baseball. And they went to some weird studios along the way to record too, by the way.
Yeah, no question they were plugged into the pyramid. No question.
They're an example of a band that actually had significant talent, though. If you watch any behind the scenes of them in the studio, for instance, you'll see that those guys actually have what it takes. But obviously, we know that they're playing ball.